Alright, so it's time for a crash course in some digital painting. And I did want to review a couple things with you guys just to remind you of things I showed you at the beginning of the semester that maybe might make a little more sense now. This is an image that I did for the Westmoreland Cultural Trust. It's in the alleyway behind that building. There's a lot going on here. It's a lot of design work, mostly like a logo type using the pen tool. But there's digital painting there, using the paint bucket for fills, doing some overlays, some different blending modes. Of course, that is one of many, many ways to use digital painting. They were happy with this, so they made like a big sticker of it and they put it in their alleyway. It's not the only way to do things, and although it is one way we've explored other ways to apply digital painting, maybe not in the most traditional sense, but in ways that allow you to create artwork of value. Remember we did the pixel art recently, so that's something that you could do. It has a cool look to it, cool style. You could always do a black and white image, a black and white digital drawing, and then paint on top of it. Maybe you're real into fantasy art, so you could do some fantasy type paintings. Or maybe you like digital caricature. This is a step-by-step I posted for my digital imaging class a couple of summers ago. If it's something you're interested in, I would be willing to send this to you in an email. So just shoot me an email and say, hey, I'd like that digital caricature tutorial you did, and I'll send it to you, and then you can follow along and maybe create your own. Though of course there's a learning curve. If you don't know how to do caricatures in the first place, just knowing how to use Photoshop isn't necessarily going to make it work for you. There are aspects of art that you have to learn before this will make sense. There's a few fruit similar to what we did in an exercise. There's a gesture drawing that I turned into a complete figure drawing back when I was taking a figure drawing course, and then I took it and I turned it into a digital painting. That's an option. Maybe you have some old drawings lying around. Maybe you did a portrait of someone or a still life and you want to paint on top of it. That's a perfect example right there. The upper right was the still life example that I had not finished on a piece of craft paper, and then I just painted on top of it using the values underneath, using blending modes to allow them to show through, using color layers and varied opacity brushes in order to paint on top. And then the portrait, which is actually of my father, I used a reference. I used a photograph, and I actually stole some colors from it, but then I made up some of my own. Whenever we did that first digital painting tutorial, it was like a landscape. It was a process-based landscape, starting from the deep background and working our way towards the foreground. This is like a step-by-step of all the cues that you would need to take to find that end result. If you want this as well, also email me, and I'd be happy to send it to you if you are interested. Using different filters on top of what you've done is always a nice effect. And then doing traditional art like an ink drawing and using the multiply mode to paint on top of it is a great way to create a beautiful finished piece of art. So let me just show you something we have not yet worked with. This is the mixer brush. I got an interesting brush here. I'm going to put some red on the page, and then I'm going to select the mixer brush, which is embedded under the regular brush tool. Then I can come up to the top into my options bar, as always, and I'm going to change my color, my red color, to a blue color, because blue and red makes purple. I want to see that purple. So now I'm going to go in and I'm going to change one of these options from dry to wet. So I'm working with a wet medium brush, and I'm just going to go right through that paint, and look, blue turns to purple as it passes through, and as it continues on, some of that red gets out of the brush, it goes back to the blue color. Just like a real paintbrush. Pretty amazing, huh? That is how the mixer brush works. Now, whether or not it's something that you would be interested in using, it's really up to you. I generally don't use it. I rely on blending modes and opacity changes in order to do my mixing. The mixer brush is a great way to simulate real painting with wet media. So I'm just trying some different types of brushes, loading it up with more paint, changing how wet the brush is. You can see here there's a lot of water on this, so you can just drag it through. It almost becomes like you're working with just a wet brush through paint and reactivating it. So there's a lot of different options here with the mixer brush. It's something that if you want to experiment with, you can. As I said, I'm not someone who tends to necessarily use it frequently. I may use it in the future. I have the option to learn to use it better, but I'm not really a direct painter, which is a term that I'll talk about whenever I start the tutorial here. I am more of an indirect painter, so this tool isn't necessarily one that I use that often, but you might think it's really cool. I definitely recommend checking it out and just playing around with some of the different brushes and going to the mixer brush and just seeing what you can do. Really, the brush tool is probably the most loaded tool in the Photoshop toolset. There's so many different things you can do. You can create your own brushes. You can create folders with brush sets in them so that you can organize your brushes. Maybe you create a bunch of your own, or you pick and choose the ones you like. You can create dual brushes where whatever brush it is that you choose off the bat, you can then go into the brush dynamics preset and pick another brush to sort of overlap with it. Then you can stretch out the spacing of the brush. You can change the orientation. There's just so many possibilities within the realm of the brush tool. It's almost overwhelming, and getting a grasp on it, being able to actually utilize it well and effectively, it's something that takes a lot of time and a lot of patience and just sort of studying all of the different things that you can do. You can see here I'm looking at the dual brush, checking out some of the possibilities. I have a brush already selected. I think it was either a hard round or a soft round. I know I'm picking a secondary brush to go with it, and then I can see what it's going to look like by spacing it out. I'm going to pick a different brush, one with a little more texture. I can come back over, check my brush dynamics, check the spacing, spread it out so I can see what it looks like before it all sort of gets meshed together into a stroke. Because it really is just a brush stroke is stamps layered on top of each other. It's really giving you so many possibilities, and the dual brush allows you to just keep combining what's already there, what they're already offering to you, so that you can make even more brushes and more presets. And it's just insane. Like, there's so many possibilities. So I think that if you're really interested in digital painting, get the equipment and just spend time with it every day. It's the only way you'll really learn what works best for you and all the different possibilities that are there for you. Okay, so I've got myself set up, and there are a couple of things that I want to make sure I have in my palette well, including my layers palette. Should always be there because we're always working in layers. Very useful to be able to work in layers, especially when we're doing digital painting, because it can separate out your different fields, your distant background, your middle ground, and your foreground, and you can adjust them separately, which is really important for what we're going to do here. And I have this here as well. This is my Coloris extension, which I bought offline. It allows me to have my color wheel right here so that I can just sample colors directly from this, as opposed to having to continually go here, which I may still do. It just depends on how I'm feeling, what my workflow's feeling like. So this is where I start. And I am of the opinion that the best paintings always start with a drawing or a sketch of some form, just to get an idea of where you want to place things, get a composition, and then go from there. Now, you don't have to do that. You could just start throwing paint at your canvas and make something up as you go, but I wanted to have a plan because, as previously stated, I am a planner, and that's just how I do things. I'm always thinking about how I want to arrange information to fit into my compositional window. And I did this really loose digital sketch of what I want to create. What I'm going to show you is going to be very quick. I'll probably fast forward through certain parts of it, but this is the sort of thing that can take a long time. When you see a finished digital piece of art, it's usually something that the artist spent multiple hours working on. I'm only going to spend a couple working on this to show you what to do. If we perhaps had a full-fledged digital painting class, it's the kind of thing we could spend a lot of time on. We could spend, several weeks on the same painting, just taking it step by step. But as it is, this is a crash course, so I'm busting through this quickly, giving you the information that you need to go on so that you can build from there. The idea with this is for me to encourage growth on your part, which requires you to do some work on your own. It can't always be following a step by step or doing what someone says. Sometimes you have to experiment on your own with what you've learned, and that's something I absolutely suggest you do, because the aha moments are going to happen through your own personal work, not just the stuff that I'm showing you. So I'm going to throw some painting terms at you so that you kind of understand my thinking, and I'm going to do two of these today. This is going to be the first one. I'm going to do direct painting with this one. And when I say direct painting, what that means is I'm doing it all at once, or alla prima. So I'm starting with my background, working my way to the foreground, and I'm sort of doing everything at one time. And a good example of that would be Bob Ross. If you've ever watched him on, I think he's on Netflix, you can probably watch all of his shows. He is a alla prima painter, and he has a method, a very specific method that he works with, where he primes the surface with his liquid white that allows the paint that he applies to remain pliable. It is oil paint, so that's kind of the nature of it. It doesn't dry quickly. He'll put on a layer of primer, imprimatura, meaning that he's putting a layer of color in for the background, for the sky. And then from there, he just builds on top of it. He builds in his different areas of background, middle ground, and foreground, just applying more and more paint on top, allowing the paint to blend, and just sort of making this really fresh, quick painting. And they're very beautiful. But he's utilizing a methodology that he spent a lot of time training himself to do. And he also makes good use of the tools that he has, in particular the types of brushes that he's using. If you've ever watched him before, you know he uses like a fan brush to create the texture of leaves or foliage. You know that he'll use like a palette knife turned on its side to create ripples in water, or he'll scrape with it to create the inconsistent patterns of snow on mountains. That's all about the tools that he's using, and he knows how to use them well. So that's something to consider whenever you're going through all your brushes and figuring out the ones that you like to use and what will work best for you. In fact, you could watch a Bob Ross tutorial and do a digital version of whatever he's doing. You just have to figure out a plan. You have to figure out what type of brush to use for your background. He uses a large fan brush. You could do that with a large soft round brush at a low opacity. The thing about Photoshop is, it's digital, so you have to create the variations in opacity and texture and tone digitally. You have to come up here and change things as you go in order to create that inconsistent look so it doesn't appear too smooth or too perfect or too, I guess, for lack of a better term, digital. And that's what a lot of digital painters do. They attempt to overlap different textures and brushes and things so that they can create that appearance of traditional painting. So a direct painting requires us to build from a base upward. We're piling paint on, and the rule of thumb when it comes to oil painting is you work from dark to light. Not all paint works that way. In fact, acrylic paint is created so that you can work in both directions, and watercolor is the opposite. You're supposed to work from light to dark and preserve your whites. Digital is different. Of course, there are digital watercolor brushes. There are ways that you can add water to your brush using the mixer brush. What we're going to do is going to be a little bit simpler, and then we'll work our way into some of the details. So the first thing I want to do, I have this digital sketch here, and it's in its own isolated and locked layer. I'm going to unlock the layer. I'm going to create a new layer underneath it, and I'm going to fill that layer with white as though it is my canvas. And then this layer that I have my sketch in, for now, I'm going to turn that into a multiply layer, and I'm going to reduce the opacity on it so that it's there as a guide and I can still see it. But eventually I'm going to trash that layer so that I can focus completely on the paint. It's just there as a guide. And I want to work in my bottom layer right now. And this is the layer that I'm going to do that Bob Ross style, paint in the background with large swaths of color. But I have to determine what my color palette's going to be for this. And it's a daytime image. I got the sun up here. So I'm thinking I want this to be a very warm image. Some of my details will be coolers to create contrast, but my overall tone is going to be something very warm. We could come over here into the colors picker and just work our way around and figure out if there's a color we like. That one's pretty nice. It's like a goldish yellow. So it has a neutral quality to it. In fact, that's something I'm looking for at this point. Now there are basic rules for painting. We're not going to get too far into all those traditional rules, but it's a good idea to make the colors you start working with somewhere in the range between the most saturated and what would be like a mid-tone neutral, because you want a lot of your colors to start off neutral and dark so that way you can build in your more saturated and bright colors as you go. So I'm going to start off with something very neutral, and this color is sort of like a yellow ochre, or like maybe somewhere between that and like a raw umber. And that's how I'm going to start off. And I'm actually going to do a fill of that foreground color in my background. And that's imprimatura. That's priming your canvas with a color so that you can work from that color upwards in value. And I'm going to start off painting values as well. But I'm going to use values of this same color. I'm all about figuring out where my light source is going to be and then painting outward from there and then layering color. And I'm going to do another layer above that, still underneath my drawing layer so I can see my guide. And I'm going to color in this layer. And I'm going to pick a slightly brighter color. Then I'm going to check out my brush. Right now my brush is at a 12. I'm going to make it real big. And at this point, remember last time I changed my cursor so that it would look like a brush? I'm going to change that back. And you have to go down to cursors for that. And I want to do full size brush tip. And hit OK. So that way the little circle shows me about how big my brush is going to be. If you recall the keyboard command to make that bigger and smaller are the brackets above the return key. I'm going to make it pretty big. Now look how dense that is. That's not what I want. I don't want it to be that opaque. I want to paint over top of what I've got. So I'm going to reduce my opacity and see what it looks like. See, it's going to allow for some inconsistency. So that's what I want, but I'm going to go even more transparent. I'm going all the way down into the 20s range. That way I can build this up. And I'm going to work around my area of light. And I continually come back to this blur when I'm first starting out so I can really build up. I'm just going to keep coming back over top of that and making this a little bit more opaque in the area where I know my light source is going to be. I have some clouds here that I need to paint in, so let's do the clouds next since they're in the sky and we're worried about the distant background first. We're like taking a walk from the distant background into the foreground. I'm going to pick out a brighter midtone like this color. Again, this is all a prima. This is all at once, so I'm jumping around a little bit here. Reduce the size of my brush. I jumped to a soft round for this. I was using a hard round before, that's why my edges were so stark. And that's about the right size. And paint in the areas where my clouds are going to be. And I am using a Wacom tablet today. I know that most of you probably don't have that option. I wish you did. I wish we could use the Wacom tablets from school. You'll have to make do with what you've got. You can do all this with a mouse. I'm opting to use my Wacom tablet because I have one and they're fun and I'm getting my money's worth out of it. So painting in these swaths of cloud, and every once in a while if you want you can turn off that drawing layer and just see what's happening here. I'm going to build up some of this a little bit more opaquely. Any of the areas that are facing towards my perceived light source. And I'm going to come back to that light source eventually and make it stronger. For now I'm worried about these clouds and getting them to have some real value to them. Actually, I'm going to sample that background color again. Then I'm going to come down here and use some of this color and paint that on top of my clouds to give the bottoms of them a little bit of depth and shadow. Let's check how that looks. Looking pretty cool so far. Alright, so now I have to determine the color of this background that is sort of like a mountain, and I was thinking I would use something in the blue-green range. Here I can use my soft round or my hard round. I'm going to jump to the hard round brush. My opacity is going to really need build up on this, but that's what I want. I like the ability to build up the color as opposed to it just being a flat color. And you can paint right over things. I'm trying to take the edges and just make sure that I'm following them. But you can paint right over some of these details because you can paint on them again in another layer. Now I could have kept that sky layer separate from what I'm doing right now, and in fact I probably should have. So let's back that up. Let's go to history, figure out where this started. It started right there. So I can come back in and remove that. and create another layer. Now if you want to, you can label these layers. This one's going to be my sky. This one's going to be my mountains. Coming back to my brush tool, and I'm just going to paint in these mountains. You can work a little bigger than this if you want to. Now this is in its own layer, so I have the ability to edit this as I'm going along. Maybe I don't like the color, maybe I think the opacity of it is too low. So what do? You can come up into image adjustments and change the brightness or the contrast. So maybe that's what we'll do. We'll make it just a little bit brighter. Again, checking, looking at where everything's at right now. I'm going to do another layer now. This one's going to be for my foliage here. These are actually going to be trees. So I'm going to call this trees. And I'm going to pick a different color this time, somewhere up in this range. And I'm actually going to push the opacity up. Because at this point things are getting closer to us, which means they will be more opaque, more distinct. That's very bright still. It's very saturated. And I want it to be more muted in tone. So since it's in its own layer, come up, reduce the contrast on it, and maybe even make it a little darker. Because that's going to enable me to go back on top of it and add highlight regions. Checking it again, just seeing what my color profile looks like at this point. And I'm going to come back up here and find a neutral brown, something very dark. And for this, I'm actually going to use this for what's underneath the trees here. And I'll be coming back in here and painting on top of it. But for now, I'm just painting in these large areas. This time I'm going to pick an even darker green than before. Reduce the size of my brush. And just paint in the edge of the land. My water is going to be blue. It's going to be a neutral blue to start, and then I'll get it to be a little bit more saturated as I build. So at this point I'm going to make another layer and call this layer water. And then these rocks, I want to make them a color that's similar to this background. So maybe you can hold in your option key at any point and sample a color. And I'm going to do this in its own layer as well. And call it rocks. And to make my brush a little bit smaller, and I'm going to push my opacity up into the 70s this time, because this is closer, and objects that are closer are always going to appear darker and more distinct, more well-defined. And then I might need something even darker, just to really separate this rock from everything else. I'm leaving some of it open so that it can be a highlight region. Add a little bit more of it here. Actually, let's back that up and let's do that in a more transparent setting. Now I could have done this a lot darker. I could have done the whole thing a lot darker to start, but I think for you guys to be able to see what I'm doing, this is going to make more sense. Now I need to think about this figure is in my foreground. And I'm going to pull from a red because there's a lot of greens, so this is going to make them stand out more. I'm going to push my opacity up as well and just go right over top of his silhouette. And then there's a couple of little guys here and there that I want to take care of as well. I've never seen Bob Ross do a dinosaur painting, so I don't know how he would approach this. If he would have certain brushes in mind for how he would paint a pterodactyl, but it's actually pterodactyls didn't have these tails, pteranodons did. But hey, it's a painting, it can be whatever I want, I don't care. And I've got these brachiosaurs in the background as well. Now I did all of that in the rock layer. I probably shouldn't have. In fact, I should probably have taken these guys and put all of the figures in a separate layer. I'm going to cut him and paste him, move him back into place. So everything is where it needs to be. And there's one more thing I want to do in a new layer. This layer is going to be my mist layer. And I'm going to actually do mist 1 and mist 2. First one that I'm going to do, I'm going to pick a color that's already present, this blue, and I'm going to come up here into this light blue, drop my opacity even further, jump to my soft round brush, push the size, and then come in and kind of go over top of it. I can make it even bigger than that. Let's make it real big. Yeah, that's good. So I've got all my basic stuff where I want it. And if I wanted to at this point, I could ditch this layer, my drawing layer, and just work in each separate layer developing. And I'm going to start off in my background layer with my sky. To use the mixer brush. You can see here that it allows you to clean off your brush so that you have a dry, empty brush to work with. And it's going to let you take what's there and move it around. You can select to load the brush after each stroke so you get more paint on it. You also have some custom features here that will allow you to choose if your brush is a dry brush, if it's got a lot of water on it, if it's a wet light mix, a wet heavy mix. So if I want to blend this with another color, knowing exactly how much water is on my brush, how much paint is on my brush, how much it's going to mix is important. And you can experiment with this all day long. Moist, everybody loves that word. Back to my smudge, and I'm just pulling that color in to the area where my light source is. You can do the same thing on the edges so that it doesn't look so stark and flat. I'm not worried about making things look more rounded. Going back to my regular brush tool, and this time I'm also going to my mountain layer. So maybe I need a different type of brush for this. So those are my general brushes, but there's also dry media brushes in here that have a nice texture to them. Chunky charcoal, pastel, special effects brushes. There's a utility texture. I don't know that you guys have all these. I know I've downloaded a lot of different brushes. But then I'm going to check in on my brush dynamics, which are down here. Brush tip shape, there are shape dynamics. And I can change the size of certain things. I can change the scattering. What about the texture of it? Maybe the texture needs to be scattered more. See what's happening down there in the preview window? I change this. It can go in both directions too. What if I want to do a dual brush? In this case, it already is a dual brush. It's already overlapping two different brushes. So right now that's what my mountains look like, but I'm not a huge fan of this brush. I feel like I want to use something a little bit more straightforward. So I'm going to pick a dry media brush. Let's try this pastel. Remember, the area that's closer to the tops of these trees is going to be darker than the top because the top part is closer to the sun and the atmosphere and our light source. You know, you could take time learning how to paint each of these separate things, like practice just painting rocks, or just painting water, or just painting leaves in order to get a better feel for it. I can only talk you through so much of that before we kind of have to keep moving. Now I'm going to smudge what I've got here a little bit. And smudging just softens areas, changes the consistency a little bit so that it looks a little different. And I don't want to get rid of all the texture that I have here. I'm allowing certain areas to just be what they are. And that requires a little bit of restraint. So I like my mountainous region. It's looking pretty cool. Let's address the trees. Now this would be a time when you might want to make a custom brush. I think we should do that. We should make a custom brush just for the sake of making one. So let's go File, New. Change the pixels. We want these to be small. So we're going to change it to like 120, 120. Create it. Blow it up so we can see what we're doing here. Now we're going to work in black. Okay, so I'm going to pick a general brush. I'm going to go with something that tapers. How about this? hard round pressure. Make it a little smaller. Let's make sure we've got brush size we can work with. That's probably good. I'm going to change the opacity, bring it down into the 20s for now. And what I'm doing is I'm just going to paint in foliage shape. So now that we've got this, let's go up and define brush preset, and we're going to call this trees. There's my tree brush. And I want to mess with the dynamics of the brush a little bit. So the brush tip shape, I want to space it out so I can really see what they look like. Maybe turn them just a little bit, scrunch them a little bit if you want to. And just think, like every time you do a layer of these, you can change it a little bit. And you will get a lot of uniformity this way, so that's why you might have to make multiple brushes and alter them as you go. I'm going to come down here and I'm going to get darker with some of the ones that are in the foreground, and they're going to get larger as well. There, we've got some variety. Now I've got down here, this region that's the brown section. So I need to change my brush again. See how by allowing some of those ones that I already painted in to remain lighter, it appears like they're in the background, like they're behind these other ones that I'm painting in. So now I'm going to look at the ground plane here that's in front of all these trees, and I'm going to pick a new brush. I have some down here that I could use, like short grass, which is actually one that I created that you've seen before. And let's take care of these rocks here. I'm sort of drawing with the paint at this point, coming in and defining edges and deciding what I want things to look like. Alright, so I'm relatively happy with how that looks. I'm going to take care of this one too, now that I'm up here. But I'm going to go darker. Now I need to look at the water. And I'm going to first start off by picking the color that's already there. And I'm going to jump up to a brighter color. I'm going to reduce my opacity to start. And you might need to take this in layers. You might need to do this in several different opaque layers and then drop the opacity in certain layers and see what you like the look of. You can imagine if this is my edge, I'm just going to kind of paint it in. If this is the edge of the water, and now I'm going to smudge this. Smudging looks really good with water because it's soft, and water has that quality to it. The reflections tend to be soft, so the way that the smudging tool works is really good for creating water. So I'm pretty happy with how this background's looking so far. I'm going to come up to my mist layer and I'm going to pull color from what's already here. I'm going to use this blue and then make it lighter. I'm going to make it even more transparent. I'm going to use a soft round brush, which is what I got right now. Hardness is all the way down. I'm just going to come in here. Actually, I'm going to make it real big, like this. And I'm just going to paint in some mist. So now we can address all these figures, and each one of them is in a separate layer. So for example, the pteranodons, pterodactyls, whichever they are, the hybrid pterodactyl pteranodons, would be the next thing to take care of. And you saw what I did there. I'm just using these as placeholders so that I know where they're going to be whenever I decide to come in there and actually figure them out. The opacity on that one is close to the same as this one. I'm just going to assume they're almost in the same place. Maybe one's just a little shorter. And then this one back here, way down. Let's make this one a little bit bigger. And then this one, actually, let's make him brighter. He's further in the background. So maybe he'll be catching more light. We'll make this one slightly brighter as well. So there's my placeholders for those guys. Now I'm going to look at the caveman. And I need to carve him out a little bit, which I could do with the smudge tool or the eraser tool. Since I didn't draw him ahead of time, I don't have hard edges or lines or anything really well defined. Smudge tool is good for that. It's very precise. Now I'm going to paint him in a little bit. Then from here I could add even stronger highlights and darker shadows, because right now everything's very basic. In fact, at this step, I would say that my underpainting is done, and it would be time to do the overpainting, which will take quite some time. So I've zoomed in real close. I'm wondering if you can tell which part this is. I'll zoom out so you can see. The caveman's face and his hair. I was smudging it a little bit, but at this point, smudging is going to take the place of actually drawing things, because you're using the smudge tool to create hard edges between things and sort of mold and sculpt the image as you want it to be. And then from there you could paint on top of it. Maybe he needs some color in his face, or like red or something like that. You could do that in another layer, and that's when we start getting into blending modes and how we can change some of this stuff using filters, just to get the overall look that we're going for. So say we did that, say we created a new layer, we made it a color mode, color blending mode, came up, grabbed some of this warmer red tone. I'm actually going to make my brush slightly larger. Actually, I'm working with the smudge tool. Make sure you're working with the right tool. Make my brush a little bit bigger. Drop my opacity some. Come in and redden up his nose. Add some color to his cheeks, maybe into his lips, a little bit in his chin. Maybe his hair's got like a blue color to it or something like that. And then even after I've done all that, I'll just make one more layer here. One of the best things to do once you've figured out all of your local colors and you kind of figured out, you can go back in and start using overlay to add more highlight, and it starts to look more 3D. and has a more finished quality to it. And again, I could spend all day doing this, several days actually, but for our purposes I just wanted you to get an idea of how this works. If you're doing a direct painting, it's kind of sloppy. I'd have a lot more to do there. And that was a lot of little details. I'd have to come in and take care of these guys, these Brachiosaurus in the background. I'd have to come in and add more detail to my mountains, my pterodactyl, everything. A lot more that could be done here. A lot more. So this was a good start. So you could do one like this. It would take time. It would take multiple hours. But hey, if you're doing it for yourself, there really is no time limit on it. Now, if you're doing it for a project, yeah, then you have to worry about the time constraints and when your deadline is. I'm not going to finish this one. I'm going to do another one. And the other one I'm going to show you the way that I personally approach this. This was a direct painting where I just kind of started slapping colors on there and started figuring out what it was going to look like as I went along. I'll usually do like a drawing of some form, and then I'll work on top of that drawing and I'll do what's called a grisaille painting or monochromatic underpainting that will allow me to already have all my values mapped out, and I can just kind of glaze color on top of it the way the old masters would if they were doing an oil painting. You see the amount of time and patience it takes to paint and create artwork. I hope, if nothing else, that taking this class and other art classes will give you a healthy respect for what artists do and the amount of time spent just learning their craft. So I'm going to stop this one and I'm going to start another one, okay? So I've made a new layer, and it's a color layer. And you saw me do this really quick, loose, pretty sloppy sketch. So what I'm going to do at this point is start coloring in what I would term local color, the colors that I actually think everything should be perceived as. Then I'll do another layer on top of that, which will be my light sources. So there's the color on top of that, and then I'm going to do another layer, and I'm going to do this one as a color dodge. Since this is going to be my light source, I'm going to make it real bright. You don't always use the blur. Sometimes it softens things too much. Sometimes you want them to be really sharp-edged highlights, like maybe right on here, right around little areas of the wood, in order to make it look really bright and reflective. And you can always use a smudge tool to drag that a little bit, if you want to. So that's all I'm going to show you in the way of digital painting. Like I said, I could spend a whole bunch of time on one specific painting, make it look really good with all the little details and textures and using mixer brush and the dual brush and all those different things I just showed you, but in the end, we'd need a lot more time. And I want to give you guys time to actually work on your final project in the upcoming weeks here. Now, if we were to have a full-fledged digital painting class, that would be different. We could take this one step at a time. We could do it slowly and methodically, but this is enough. This is enough for you to understand how it works, I think. This is the thing that I spent the most time learning and doing, and I'm still learning a lot. So it's something that takes an awful lot of time and focus. We could spend so much time with this. It's so much fun. I wish we had more time. And I wish we had the ability to work together side by side so that I could actually see what you're doing and we could, work off of each other. But as it is, this is the best I can do for you, and I hope it's helpful. It was fun for me to create this, and I look forward to seeing the things that you guys will be creating in the coming weeks. So, like I said, this is our last digital painting tutorial. I'm going to have some stuff to talk to you about next time, and until then, try one of your own. Just do one for fun. Relax, enjoy the process. I hope everybody's healthy and doing well. We'll see ya.
முசுலம்பட்டி பெண்குட்டி முத்து பேச்சு அவசரம் பார்த்தே என் கழுத்து சுளுக்கி போச்சு முசுலம்பட்டி பெண்குட்டி முத்து பேச்சு அவசரம் பார்த்தே என் கழுத்து சுளுக்கி போச்சு வச்சு குச்சனூறு பரவள மெதுவாக செல்லேண்டி உன் கூடையில வச்ச பூவு கூடனூரில் விசுதடி குதி போட்டு வந்தேண்டி முசுலம்பட்டி பெண்குட்டி முத்து பேச்சு அவசரம் பார்த்தே என் கழுத்து சுளுக்கி போச்சு கண்டமனூரு மைதார கண்ணுல வச்சா ஆகாதா
மைய வைக்கும் சாக்க வச்சு கைய வைப்ப தெரியாதா
அலங்கநல்லூர் ஜல்லிக்கட்டு சேர்ந்து போனால் ஆகாதா
மாடு பிடிச்சு முடிச்ச கையை மயில பிடிப்பே தெரியாதா
மயிலே மயிலே இறகு போடு இறகு எது கடி தோகைய கிடைக்கும் அதுக்கும் காலம் வரும்
உசுலம்பட்டி பெண்குட்டி முத்து பேச்சு நீ ஓர கண்ணால் பார்த்தாலே நான் புள்ளத்தாச்சு உசுலம்பட்டி பெண்குட்டி முத்து பேச்சு நீ ஓர கண்ணால் பார்த்தாலே நான் புள்ளத்தாச்சு கூட மேல கூட வச்சு குச்சனூறு புறவள துருவீதா கேட்காதே கூடையில வச்ச புகு கூடலூரில் விசுதுன்னு உருவீதான் பார்க்காதே